And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Trolling with Logic for the 26th of March 2016. Just to all the usual announcements, we do take live calls during the course of the show tonight. Add the Skype contact Trolling with Logic. Send us a PM and we'll add you in due course. Please don't call the show, as it will just distract us. We will add you to the call in due time. So just with all that out the way, it's a pretty depleted panel tonight, but all the introductions. Marty, what's happening?
I had some connection problems, but
Yeah.
it looks like it's working now.
Yeah. Oh, and just one quick announcement. There was problems setting up the YouTube stream. I just couldn't get my head around what was going on. So it is Vaughan only tonight. So just a few issues, but I think we're okay now. Anyway, I'll quickly jump over. And Kitch, how are you doing?
Fantastic. I'm fully back from the sun.
We can see that. An Irishman in the sun, you know what the results are. So, Kitch, you're here to introduce our special guest tonight.
Yes, our guest tonight is Dr. and I'm really sorry because I know I'm going to pronounce this badly, Dr. Channapatna S. Prakash. He received his bachelor's degree in agriculture and a master's in genetics, and he received a PhD in forestry/genetics from the Australian National University. He's a professor of plant genetics, biotechnology, and genomics at Tuskegee University, where he researches gene improvement research on food crops. Sorry, I'm literally just scratching everything down. So he served in the USDA Agricultural Biotechnology and part of the advisory committee, and he was a part of the advisory committee into the Department of Biotech in India. He has been instrumental in catalyzing the scientific community in many countries to be more proactive in the area of biotechnology. And his website, Biotech, provides important information and promotes discussion of ag biotechnology among scientists, policymakers, activists, and journalists. And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
And Kitch will let you start with the introductory questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think a pretty standard for question that we usually do for first is how did you get involved in the area that you were researching?
Oh, see, I was trained primarily as a plant breeder, where we have used many traditional tools in genetics to help develop new varieties of crop plants. And in the mid 80s, when I was doing my PhD, the biotechnology came along, and then this was logical for a lot of us who were working in plant breeding to start learning about the new tools in biotechnology, which is primarily starting with plant tissue culture and then introduction of the genes into crop plants, because it was one of the new we primarily saw it and still do as just an additional tool in developing new crop plants, and quite excited about it at the time. And so that's how I came along into using biotechnology as a component of my research, but never knew that over time that this would become so controversial as it has become today.
And why do you think it has become so controversial?
Well, looking back, I believe that the whole controversy has really been simply being orchestrated by groups that have a vested interest in opposing biotechnology, because as I told earlier, in the beginning it was not controversial, even in Europe. For instance, in England in 1996, they had a tomato that was genetically engineered, and it was a tomato puree. It was very clearly labeled as it was genetically modified, and this was just it was in the supermarket, and nobody had any opposition to that. And I think there was a range of factors, again, especially in Europe, how the whole opposition to biotechnology was sown and spread around the world because of a range of factors. I think because of the mad cow disease that came along in the late 90s, that eroded a lot of trust amongst regulators and food safety authorities in the minds of the public. And also several green groups saw this as a very lucrative target that they can attack and then get into the more into the public arena. And also many of the newspapers started sensationalizing biotechnology stories, although many of them were not true. And so I think this is how it got started. And then several food companies started worrying about the negative image of biotechnology that was being painted, and started saying that they're not going to be using GMO products in their foods. And so that's how the whole cascade of events that began. And that's what we have today is the whole controversy about GMO.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, you said a couple of things that I thought sounded very interesting. First, you mentioned mad cow disease. Yeah, I can sort of understand why people would become more safety conscious because of something like that, because I mean, that was a big deal. But have people been linking that to biotech or GMOs? What's that all about?
No, not really. Yeah, I don't think I mean, there's no relationship between mad cow and the GMO, and people have not linked to it. But the point is, the GMOs were being introduced into our food chain in the middle of 90s, when the mad cow disease also made its entry. And so what I'm saying is, the same people who are saying that there was no risk of mad cow disease, when especially in England, for instance, you had an agriculture minister who was reassuring the public that English beef is safe. If you eat it, you're not going to get any mad cow. And he famously ate a hamburger and fed it to his child on television. And later, it was proven that mad cow could be transmitted from cows to humans. And so what I'm trying to say is that the whole trust about the food safety authorities and about the regulators were eroded. And it was the same regulators and the food safety authorities were saying, hey, now GMOs are safe. You have nothing to worry about. You see, and so it was in that climate of erosion of trust when GMOs.
Okay. Now that cleared that up. Another thing you mentioned was groups were
honesty, but it's just the groups such as Greenpeace is a famous example.
Yeah.
And Greenpeace traditionally, as you know, in the mid 80s, there was the Rainbow Warrior, and the main campaign was against the nuclear plants and the nuclear weapons. And then, of course, they started attacking the GMO. They started beginning to attack the GMOs. And the Green Party in West Germany and some of the green groups in Europe also started campaigning against the GMO, primarily because this was a new area. And I do believe it's lucrative in the sense because many of these groups also had to raise money and starting attacking GMOs as an unsafe food. And also it was something being introduced through corporations, mainly American corporations, was also good for fundraising and also politically very appealing for many of these groups.
Yeah, because they have political goals as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of anti-authority sort of policies, I guess.
Certainly. And, in 1999, there was a big World Trade Organization summit, and many countries from around the world gathered in Seattle here in the United States. And that was one of the very first huge events where a lot of activists who were opposed to the trade, who were opposed to globalization showed up. And it was a very messy affair. And I was there too. There were tear gases and and it was covered by the worldwide media. And one of the campaigns that was being waged against WTO was also against the new GMOs that were being introduced. And so I think that was one of the very first time where it became a global phenomenon, the anti-GMO campaign. And it was very widely covered in the news, mainly because of the high prominence of the WTO meeting and the theatrical elements that one could see with the tear gas and everything in the streets of Seattle at that time.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll just take this moment to introduce our late co-host, Pumpkin. Hi there.
Hi.
Hello.
How did you, Doctor?
Coming through very faint, Pumpkin. All right, anyway, we'll just carry on. There was a question that came in through the chat room, and it's guest 9159, lots of other numbers.
I see it there.
Yep.
I see it there.
It's what can so I'll ask it because what can scientists do to change the discussion around GMOs?
Sorry, say that again. I didn't get
It's
the problem.
what can scientists do to change the discussion around GMOs?
Right. I think scientists, especially scientists in the academia and in the academic, in the public sector, do have a very large responsibility. Those who work in the GM, those who understand, to provide a more science-based and reason-based and evidence-based information into the debate, and to inject themselves and to inform the public as to what kind of tests go into making sure that these GMOs are safe, and then to put this in the whole context. Because one of the most important questions that I get asked all the time is, how can you assure me that these GMOs are safe? And then how can you assure me that in the long run nothing's going to happen to me if I eat these GMOs? And so there's a lot of doubts in public's minds about the safety of GMO, and scientists, and especially those scientists who are working in genetics and use genetics in their research and understand this whole area of GMO, need to step into the public arena and help explain in a manner that people can understand what this whole GMO technology is all about, and to put it in the context, in the long history of many genetic techniques that we have used to breed our croplands or livestock. You see, we've been using hybridization, we've been crossing our croplands with wild species, we've been using mutagenesis like irradiation and chemicals to bring about changes in our croplands. And in those long line of the techniques that we've used in the past 30 years, we have begun to use this gene transfer technology. And in more hotter techniques now, and probably going to be more prominent in the future, is a new technique called gene editing, also called as CRISPR-Cas9 technology, which helps us to not introduce any foreign genes into croplands, but essentially edit the genes that are already in the cropland, so as to develop new varieties through very fine tuning of the genome sequences.
Okay, right, well, sorry, I'll just check again. Pumpkin, can you hear us now?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, that's a lot better. All right, Kitch, I'll let you jump in with if you have a response to that, because this is kind of more your area, that. Kitch, do you hear me?
Muted.
You're muted, Kitch.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, the old classic never fails. All right, Kitch, yes, you have a point there.
How do I technology? How just on the issue of science communication, there are scientists that actually are out correcting misinformation on the issue of GMO crops, but we notice that there is a lot of negativity they get back online, undue negativity. Just as a recent example, Kevin Folty and what happened with him just all the nasty stuff he gets online. Do you find that's what you get when you promote genetic modification?
Yes, to a certain extent, but Kevin Folta, the one you're talking about, is a professor at the University of Florida and a really an amazing science communicator who has been at the forefront in talking about GMOs. But I think Kevin has got his more than his share of attacks, primarily because I think he is far more active and he's far more present in some of the forums like Reddit, and he gets into a lot of these online discussion groups, and he probably gets more criticism than and then the kind of confrontation than I would normally get into. But nevertheless, it is fairly common, and I think you all know that internet is a really nasty place, especially in terms of as a public discussion forum, because people can get the attacks can get very intense and personal, and so but and this is not unique to the issue of GMOs, and anybody who has looked at the comments on YouTube, for instance, will notice that. But nevertheless,
we're all very familiar with that.
I'm sure you are, and we are too. But nevertheless, and Kevin has also been very gracious in this as to how he has handled it, and in trying to change a lot of minds by showing that you don't need to get embroiled in name calling and a lot of nasty discourse that we see, but as long as we limit our discussion to science and reason, and so I think he has done a great job in trying to convince a lot of people that, and you could engage in a civil discussion, and even while talking about very controversial issues, you don't have to agree with each other, but we can always respect each other's opinion, and we can always agree to disagree.
Related to that, Kitch asked about scientists. What would you say is the role of science educators in all this?
I think science educators have a very big role to play in any area of which gets into the public arena, and it's not necessarily, the science is very nuanced and complex. It's very easy for those who have a vested interest to make it more emotional. So there are a lot of issues. It's not just GMO, for instance, climate change, for instance. And science educators have a very important role to bring the science into the public space and in a manner that the people can understand. Even if there are very complex issues, science educators, with their training, with their knowledge of science, but also with their ability to communicate, should be able to bring it and help the person on the street understand many of the issues without having to get into too much technical, without having to use too many jargons. And not all of us are capable of doing, not all scientists are able to do a good job. And so science educators can tread the middle line in helping bring the message to the public.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. There are great scientists who know, well, if it wasn't obvious, I am a physics teacher. So it's not I'm involved in science education, even if it's a different science. But I get this impression a lot that there are many scientists who are really great at what they do, and they know a lot more than I do, but they can't communicate it because they always put everything at a level that assumes that they're at least talking to an undergraduate.
Right.
If they're talking to a complete layperson and that's what they have to do, then it just goes straight over their head, and it just sounds like complete gibberish. And then you get the whole, oh, that's just jargon you're throwing out there to hide your dishonesty behind words I don't understand, or blah, blah, blah. So
Exactly.
I think science education is very important in that regard.
Certainly, I think you made a very important point. There's so much of everyday life, what we do today has been improved because of science. Now that we are in different continents and we are talking in real time, is really an amazing testimony to science. And we know today more than ever in the history of humanity, every minute of what we do has been impacted by science. And one of the biggest innovations that has come along, for instance, is the use of mobile phone technology. I am originally from India. When I go back home and I see even some of the poorest of the poor use this mobile phone technology in a very meaningful manner, and as so much it has improved the quality of their life in many ways. And we are living longer, we are living better, and even in many developing countries, and it's all because of science. And of course, science is also, or the use of science, the technological use has been misused, like we see it very clearly when we just have to turn on the news, that we can see how this is being misused, but also the negative impact of many of the scientific innovations. You can name me any innovations and I can tell, there's going to be a great benefit, but there is also certain cost associated with it. And genetic engineering and the use of GMOs in crops, perhaps to a certain extent, is a good example of that, where I see there's been great benefit from the use of GMOs. We see there has been an increased income for many of the farmers who grow these GM crops. There has been a decrease of pesticides. For instance, in India, where they grow BT cotton, 99% of the Indian farmers have embraced this technology, even though the cost of the seeds is a little higher, clearly because it has helped bring more profit to their operation, but also cut down the amount of pesticides. And we have many GM crops in development that can help with the impending dangers of global warming and through the climate resilient crops. And we also have crops in development that can bring greater nutrition, dietary nutrition to the people. And so there's a great benefit from the use of this technology, and there may be small associated risks. And what a good science educator would do is to lay it out on the table and show and talk about how that when we move forward, that we are going to have both positive and negative consequences of this technology. But if people are more well informed, then they are able to make better decisions in a manner that how they can harness the benefits of this technology while keeping some of the problem to a bare minimum.
Okay, Pumpkin, you can come in. You had the chat room question ready to go there.
Question here from Peachy Keen 80. With the new modification methods in the news more, such as CRISPR-Cas9, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation.
No, that's very good.
Oh, no, I thought it was going to be some weird scientific. Anyway, do you think that will change how the public perceives genetic modifications, particularly in regards to GMO crops?
Right. I hope so. And I do think with the advent of some of this technology, what you're talking about, CRISPR-Cas9, is the gene editing technology, which is again moving away from the traditional GMOs, which involve introduction of foreign genes into crop plants, is where now we're going to move into using the new techniques where we simply make small, minor targeted changes into the plant genome so that there is not going to be any foreign genes into that. I think if we are very honest about this in a manner, if we go about, this will help increase public acceptance of this technology. But some of the groups who are opposed to this technology are still not going to relent about it because they still believe this is going to be genetic engineering. It still is going to be primarily in the hands of big multinational companies. And so some of those critics who are against this GMO technology, not because of safety, but because of some of the larger socio-political reasons, I don't think they are going to be accepting this, whether it is GMO or gene editing. But overall, I do believe in the general public. If we make a good attempt to help explain what the new technology is about and how this is a much better refinement of some of the traditional older GMO technologies, it might lead to a more societal acceptance of the new biotechnologies.
I'm curious if, in your eyes, the higher prevalence of hatred for GMOs, specifically in more developed areas, do you think that's down simply to the fact that people have the option of hating that and getting away with it, as opposed to in areas, as you have mentioned many times, India, the more rural, less developed areas, where they simply, it's less of a simple choice. Do you think it's sort of Western, more developed influences pushing on?
Yes, I think it's to a large extent, you're right, because much of the opposition to this, for instance, is coming from Europe, where many of the people, the experts, are of the wrong opinion. They don't necessarily need biotechnology, and right now that might be true because Europe already has very high food production, and you don't see many starving people in Europe, and so while Europe deliberately and willingly they do accept biotechnology, for instance, in medicine and in many other areas, they're not really accepting biotechnology in crops because of that reason. But on the other hand, when you look at India or say Bangladesh or many other developing countries where and a typical family spends about 80% of their income on the food, and where a failure of the harvest, like what's happening right now in southern African countries, with a very serious drought and where there's an impending famine. And when we have these technologies that are able to help prevent some of those, clearly there's a greater relevance of agricultural biotechnologies in many of the developing countries, simply because they have a greater problem with food. And with all this climate change scenarios, they're going to have even more dire problem with the food. And you don't see many people protesting against biotechnology in the streets of Nairobi or Dhaka, like what we would see in the US or Europe. Okay. So I think it is mainly a first world problem that is being imposed on the third world.
Guys, can you carry on with the questions? We do have a caller lined up, so I'm just going to sort them out and add them into the call. So one of you guys can carry on the conversation.
Sure.
There was a question here in the chat room. I don't know if that was mentioned. With new modification methods in the news more, such as that you were talking about it. Yeah. Never mind.
It does seem to be. It is a very much a first world issue. This whole controversy of genetic modification, even among. So the one thing I'm glad that I haven't really seen is, unlike vaccine denialism or other forms of denialism, activists haven't gone over to these foreign countries, third world countries, to start kind of promoting this denialism or this pseudoscience. I'm not sure what the best way to describe it as. Mm-hmm. Do you think that, unlike, say, vaccine denialism or even worse, the AIDS denialism which happened in South Africa, do you think that's because they know that they're not going to get much of a victory, or there's not much point going over there, or do they don't really care about these countries, or is it because, or have they tried and they just haven't been as successful?
Yeah, it's very hard for me to understand the opposition to any of this, whether it's vaccine or even how the whole age denialism that came about because of few maverick scientists in the West. In this case, it was Professor Duisberg in UC Berkeley, who was very well known for a stance saying that HIV does not cause AIDS. And what you're referring to here is a famous case. The South African government, especially their health minister, said that South Africa doesn't have to invest in many of the HIV treatments, and they famously asked their the AIDS patients to eat garlic and onion, saying that that would help cure the AIDS. And literally, tens of thousands of South Africans died because of that. And so shows how embracing the junk science, especially when you're relying on public policy, in crafting your public policy, can lead to very disastrous consequences. And we have a lot of historical anecdotes for that, historical evidence for that. Soviet Union in the 30s famously denied genetics as a science, and they put many of the crop geneticists in prison. And one of the very famous scientists at that time, called Vavilov, who came up with the concept of biodiversity and the crop origin in many different places as to how each crop has an origin in different parts of the world, was put in prison and ironically died of starvation. And so it's very easy for some of the groups who are opposed to these technologies, for whatever vested interest that they have, for them to do that. But one needs to be cognizant, or one needs to be aware of what happens when you deny these technologies to those who need most. A good example right now is golden rice, and many people know what golden rice is. It is a rice with enriched vitamin A or pro-vitamin A content because of a couple of maize or corn genes that have been put into it. You see, the problem is there's a very high vitamin A deficiency in many parts of the developing world. And this vitamin A deficiency causes something like 500,000 children to go blind every year, which is a very, very unfortunate situation because of lack of vitamin A in their diet. And most of these people eat rice. And there are about 120, 130,000 varieties of rice in the world, and not a single one has any vitamin A or pro-vitamin A in the grain. And so this golden rice, for the first time, is able to deliver the required amounts of precursor to vitamin A, the beta carotene, into the diet, so much so that if this becomes popular, we would be able to practically eliminate the vitamin A deficiency from rice-eating parts of the world, especially in Asia. And although this technology was developed 20 years ago, it is still sitting on the shelf, primarily because of opposition to GMO technologies and all the fears that has been whipped up against this, so much so that many developing countries who could benefit from the technology, what they have done today is to simply put many barriers against accepting this technology through regulation and policies that are not very enabling.
Okay, I think we have to call her in.
Yeah, caller, are you there? Hello, caller. Say something.
Don't be shy.
Hello, caller. Can you hear us? No, we're not having any luck there. We can't hear.
How about now?
Oh, yep,
How
there.
about now?
Yeah, there you are. We got you now. Okay, well.
Hey.
Okay, welcome to the show. I'm just going to call you Van because I'm not going to pronounce the whole name. But you're on with Dr. Prakash, so ask your question.
Hi, Prakash. This is Alison Van Inenham from UC Davis calling from
Hi,
California.
Alison.
Hey, how you doing?
Nice.
So I guess my question, Prakash, is that, we've been putting the science out there for 20 years, and the majority of people consider this technology unsafe. They listen to people like Jeffrey Smith, and we've even got legislatures who say that the seeds of deception is their Bible. I would say we haven't done a good job of getting our information out there, and what can we do differently to change the discourse?
Oh, thank you, Alison. I don't know. I think you are one of the global experts in biotechnology, and you've done such a great job from University of California, Davis, to bring an awareness of this technology to people in such a elegant manner. our job is made more difficult because of like individuals that you mentioned, Jeffrey Smith, who is not a scientist and who is not an expert, and yet he goes around the world denigrating this technology and creating in the fears in the minds of people, and that makes it very difficult. And I really think we need to have more science communicators like yourself who need to be out in the open and talking about the usefulness of biotechnology. But also I think we need to have some products in the market that people can relate to and they can see, and like golden rice, for instance, and that would help change the minds of the public. And we also need to see how we can bring greater acceptance of this technology in Europe, because I think Europe is the epicenter of the opposition to this technology. And because so many European countries are opposed to this, and they have such a direct influence on countries such as in Africa, if we try to bring about a change in the Europe, hopefully we'll be able to bring about a change in the rest of the world. So I still don't have any good answers how we can do a better job, but I think not trying is definitely not the answer, and that's how some of the critics are trying to do by trying to silence us.
I definitely feel it's also in the hands of probably some of our listeners out there who are passionate about science to help spread the good science around.
Right.
The more people that are actively reading, promoting the good science, countering the bad science, the easier it will be to trump these.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree, because I think it's too important to the science of genetics and genetic engineering is too important to be left to scientists alone. So I think when we have more citizen science activists that are pro-science that we are seeing in the last few years, especially in the social media, I think that would help bring about a change in the mindset, specifically young people.
Because a lot of the disinformation comes from social media.
Absolutely. Social media is very rife with misinformation. And if you just put, for instance, GMO into the search box of Google, you get all kinds of nonsense that has been perpetuated against this technology. And so it is not surprising that most people have such a slanted view of what it is and what it can be done. But on the other hand, it is a challenging task for a lot of us to see how we can try to bring about the real possibilities, the fantastic possibilities that how it could, what this technology can do to help bring about great benefits to the world, especially the developing world.
I definitely think social media is actively promoting the bad science, because it's easier to share a meme, a bad science meme, rather to think about it critically.
I agree. And it's with anything, if it's then it's when the news, what we say is safe, is very bland, but on the other hand, it's very easy to sensationalize and emotion, bring an element of scare into this, and that makes it far more popular and accepting. And it's very natural for people, especially young people, to be skeptical of authorities and skeptical of the establishment. And so they do see this technology as being a product of the establishment. And that is one of the reasons why we have opposition to this technology, especially among the young minds.
I think that's why events like biohacking, I know there's a biohackers space in Manchester. I'm not too sure about elsewhere if it's picked up popularity, but it's a really good way of getting the people in, showing them the science, showing exactly how you would go about modifying an organism and getting them to do their own experiments. It seems like that'd be a really good way of hands-on education.
I agree.
Any other questions there?
From me?
Yeah. Sorry.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
yeah, I guess it's been interesting. I'm not sure if you saw there's an anti-vaccine movie that's been submitted
Oh, yeah.
to, I think, the Tribeca Festival.
Yeah.
And it's been kind of heartening to see the response on social media to that. And it's interesting that we haven't had a similar response around GMOs when equally preposterous movies have come out. And we seem to have kind of this spiral of silence around this particular topic where people are hesitant to speak up about it. And I think part of it is there's many different aspects that people are worried about, maybe herbicide use, maybe the toxicity of Roundup, maybe multinational corporations. And so depending upon what little aspect of GMOs people are worried about, we just don't seem to have that solidified voice speaking out in for the possibilities of this breeding method to actually solve problems in agriculture. And why don't we have that unified voice that you're seeing now when you have, stuff like the anti-vaxxer movie come out, where you're actually seeing the scientists come together and be quite effective, I think.
That's true.
I'm sorry. One thing that I noticed recently was that someone who is supporting GMOs is Bill Nye. I mean, granted, he's not involved in that field, but he is a well-known science communicator. So that has to be at least a small victory.
Yeah, he was against them, or at least skeptical, and I think that he has changed his opinion, and he let the evidence change his mind, which is kind of the definition of science, right? So that was a positive.
Yeah, but
Right. Also, other science communicators, very high-profile science communicators like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's very popular also, along with Bill Nye, is also very pro-GMO. And so we need a lot more spokespersons of, they may not be scientists, but they may have high credibility, and they are very much in the public the arena. And if they come and start speaking in support of this technology, that will also help change the mind. But one more thing, compared to vaccine or global climate change, the GMO, in contrast, there is not much greater understanding of this or acceptance of this from the public, primarily because, you see, we all have experienced, we have taken vaccinations, we have been immunized, so we have personal familiarity with it. And that's how we see the global climate thing, because we can easily relate to the climate. But I personally believe most people would not be able to relate to what's happening in the field of agriculture, especially plant breeding. There is much ignorance about it, and that's what is responsible as to why so much misinformation has gone into those minds in the absence of credible information and lack of good understanding of what the whole area is agriculture and how it has evolved.
Anything else there, caller?
No.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks very much for your call. It's greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and guys, you can carry on there if you have any questions. Right, I'll take one up there. And it's like quite a good thing that. Do you think that actually maybe another group of people we should be lobbying and trying to get on the side of GMOs is celebrities, just ordinary celebrities? Do you think, because they're pointing out in the chat room, there's that the Andrew Wakefield documentary that's just been released, and Robert De Niro's a big supporter, and that's going to make I mean, do you think that could make a big difference?
I think so. Any time when we have, I'm not talking about the Hollywood celebrities, but anyone who is trusted, whose voice is trusted, would help bring about this discussion. And when they start talking about how this is a science that could be of help to the humanity, and this is a tool that we could, with under checks and balances with the system of regulation that we have, can be safely deployed to bring about new benefits, new variations, and new benefits, would clearly help. For instance, you see, in the late 90s, there was a scare against one chemical that was used on apple called LR. Apple farmers used to spray this chemical as a way to haze on ripening and bring about ripening. And there was a television story from 60 Minutes, CBS 60 Minutes, saying that it may be carcinogenic. And there was couple of Hollywood actors who were involved in saying that. And so there was a lot of scare, and people, the apple, consumption of apples came down, and there was a lot of scare, and Apple industry was clearly worried. But then the Surgeon General at that time, or Everett Koch, who was very popular here in the United States because he waged a very strong campaign against smoking, and he was very highly popular, came on television and said, look, this LR is safe and you can eat apples, it's not going to hurt you. And there is no scientific basis that use of that particular chemical causes any cancer. And then the whole controversy immediately dissipated. So what I'm trying to say here is, when we have high profile individuals who are highly respected in the society, and if they come aboard and start talking positively about this technology or any technology, and that will also help in greater acceptance in the minds of the public. Because a lot of times, public doesn't want to know the whole science behind it, because if you see, there's also question in the minds of people about how mobile phones can cause cancer, right? And so a lot of times, I don't, as a lay person in that field, I don't necessarily need to understand all the science behind it, but I just want an assurance from somebody who understands to tell me, to say that it is safe. And so that would also help with the whole GMO controversy here.
It's not, at least in my interactions with the people who are so vehemently against GMOs, a lot of them are very heavily they're just conspiracy nuts. There's no nice way to put it. They think that the government is out to get them, that NASA's fake, that all of this crazy nonsense, and no matter how many intelligent, well-respected people turn around and say, it's safe, don't worry about it, they say, no, that's part of the conspiracy. Does it do you think it'll ever get to the stage where, I realize that the most hardline of those people are just almost beyond help, but do you think that it'll ever get to the stage where people just say, oh yeah, it's fine?
Yeah, I think so. A lot of times, many of these controversies have a certain shelf life, and people, now don't question about Apollo landing on the moon as much as the controversy was about that a few years ago. And hopefully, if it is really the controversy is due to those kinds of doubts, and over time, people will come to their senses and they move on. And I hope that will happen with this technology too. And I think it's some of the same people who believe in conspiracy theories trying to promote their point of view on this technology. And hopefully they'll move on and find new conspiracy to feed their fears. And one simple answer to all those conspiracy buffs is, yeah, it's the same government that you are afraid of bringing in this technology was not able to hack a simple iPhone or get, in this recently in the case of with the San Bernardino terrorist, the mighty United States government could not get onto the and put pressure on the Apple
If
there's a
memory
company
serves me,
who-
that story,
who are noticed. So, there's only so much the governments can do. And so when you look into the reality of everything, then one will see that whether it's a government or the corporations, you can only have that conspiracy to hide from the people if there's any reality for only so long. There's always going to be somebody who's going to come out and show what the truth is. And in this case, 99% of the scientists who are working in the GMO say that this is a safe technology, and we have about 2,200 research papers that have looked at the safety of this, and they have come about very clearly saying that this is safe. They can't find any problem with it, and so most of them can't be wrong.
Yeah, there's always seems to be someone making a profit when there's a conspiracy, but it's usually not who the conspiracy is about.
That's true. And historically, there's always been, when you see opposition to certain things, there's always a vested interest behind it, an economic interest. Up until 1930s, apparently in London, used to have gas lamps in the streets. Although in most other countries, they had gotten away with it. They had electric lamps simply because of the gas industry lobby. And so, and that's what happened when you bring in new technologies and new innovation. There's always going to be somebody who's going to be affected by that, and they're going to resist it.
the idea that big pharma is coming to get you. By the way, have some healing crystals.
Right. Absolutely.
Right, guys, any other questions there? Chat room questions, so Pumpkin.
Yeah, I saw that.
Pumpkin,
Okay.
you take away the chat room questions.
Yeah, sure. H. Keen 80 again. Changing public opinion is important, but how do we overcome the problem of politicians having little to no science knowledge and then making laws affecting science? We see these issues popping up with food labels, vaccines, climate change, etc.
Yeah, I think that is far more difficult when you're working in politics. But again, when you're working with politics, if you are able to show that public opinion in their constituencies tend to favor certain policies, politicians always tend to look more carefully as to how their constituents look at these issues. And so to bring about a change in the mind of politicians, we need to bring about a change in the minds of the public. That's easier said than done. But I think when we have a much educated public, when we have a much accepting science, accepting public, then those public will also get the kind of politicians that they deserve.
All right, Pumpkin, there's another chat room question there.
There is?
I thought there was.
No,
Oh, no.
there is not.
No, there isn't. Sorry, my mistake there. Guys, do you have any other questions there? No, am I transmitting at all?
Yeah, you are.
All right.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of things.
Yeah, I think there is one
Actually,
kind of. I think. Sorry, I'll just say there's one very basic question. I think this is kind of for all. What actually is biotech, basically? Because a lot of people even have difficulty with that word because they think
Right.
they think of biotech and you're growing a fish with human arms and weird things like that. So, what exactly is biotech?
You read my latest paper.
The secrets
Right.
I catch.
Itch. We saw the experiments in your basement.
I know. Biotechnology means different things to different people. One could also define biotechnology in a very broad sense that a lot of things we've been using for thousands of years, with use of any biological organisms to help the humanity, can be termed biotechnology in a very broad sense. But the kind of biotechnology we're talking about now is really the use of genetic engineering. When there is a recombinant DNA, specifically trying to modify the DNA bringing about a change in the organism by trying to change the DNA sequence is what the biotechnology that we are talking about, and is what the controversial aspect of biotechnology. But again, by the same definition, when we move into some of the newer techniques of biotechnology that we discussed early on, like CRISPR, does not involve transfer of foreign genes from various sources. So in other words, I know Greenpeace has made a big hay of putting a fish gene into the strawberry, and the icon of biotechnology comes to people's mind is Frankensteinian tomatoes or strawberry with animal genes in them. Is not going to be the stuff of many of the future crop breeding that we are talking about. This is going to be much more fine-tuned, small changes within the genome without involving any transfer of foreign genes. And that's where much of the future biotechnology is going to be.
I've always thought, in the back of my mind, it always seems, going back to the question I had earlier about the whole first world problems becoming problems for the entire world. Do you think if there was to be a product that just appealed to first world, the first world in general, like I'm trying to think, like corn that tasted like chocolate or something like that, something that was something that's just, it has no nutritional benefit, but it's just nice, like something. Do you think that would progress things, or would it just be like just another shiny thing to put on the mantle?
Well, anything that would help bring about a positive view of this technology in the minds of the public, especially in the first world, would be helpful. Because much of the research is really in the first world. Europe and the United States were the pioneers in developing this technology, and they are using this technology to a great benefit in so many areas. 90% of all the drugs in the clinical trial today have been developed through biotechnology. And so we have many, many new fascinating products that are being developed through biotechnology. And so what we really need to do is to tell a better story of how this science, if it's allowed to flourish, is going to help us to live better, live longer, and also take better care of the environment, and then try to convince the public through good science and through better products is what is going to help us in the long run. And first world, one good example would be as to how in Europe, for instance, in about 100 years ago, all the grapes in France were completely threatened with a nematode, a nasty pest. And every grape that has been planted today in France is resting on the rootstock of what they got from grape vines they got from California. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is the first world has the wherewithal to use this technology if some of their products are threatened. See what I mean? If there is a threat to the food security in the first world, if there is a threat to a new potato disease or a new wheat disease that is going to help, that is going to destroy our crop, then and if the biotechnology will rescue it, this will be seen in a more positive light. And I'm not asking for that, but historically we have seen when any society that is, that has its priorities would be rearranged if there are new threats coming along. And for the third world, right now, feeding its people is the most important priority. And trying to accept any technologies that would help them to do a better job of that, they are going to be receptive to that more than the first world.
I just think that Pumpkin brought up a very good idea here. If we, yeah, I said that.
Sounds so surprised.
If we assume then that there is no new threat coming, and what is it that drives people in the first world? Well, it's basically increased comfort, increased pleasure.
Right. And
Make the food taste better. That would be just a great thing to do. I mean, granted, it's not going to save lives, but it might make people like this technology more. And then you could save lives.
One major thing before we continue, Dr. Prakash, you did say earlier about a potential new potato disease. Myself and Kitch are Irish. Please don't scare us like that.
All right. I know it too well because I talk about that in my class. And there is always, potato in Ireland was the most famous case, but we have threats all the time. Right now, there is a new rust disease that is threatening the wheat and bananas. You can't breed bananas because they don't have seeds. And bananas are very important in African diet. But there are two diseases that are threatening banana, and it can potentially be wiped out. And so we must be on guard. And we had a beautiful chestnut tree. There were 4 billion of them in the United States, and all of them were wiped out. And so are the elm trees in the Europe. And there's always a new threat with disease and pest that makes our crops and our food very vulnerable. And having technologies that help us provide a layer of protection against the threats is something that we cannot take it lightly, and biotechnology is one of them.
And is there also, has it also been discussed about using biotechnology in the case of the Zika virus? I've been trying to catch up on that. Haven't really got a chance to, but I have seen that has been discussed.
Certainly. Right. This is a very scary virus, as you know, and it's making such a nasty impact because it can affect the brain of the fetus, and the children who are born as mothers infected with Zika virus have such a very sad brain deformity. And one of the most important tools that we have against this virus is an innovation that came from Oxford University in England, where they use the sterile mosquito technique. And by genetically engineering mosquitoes in a way to make them sterile is to spread the sterility within the population of those carrying this virus or any virus. It's been shown very effective in trials that they've done with dengue virus, which is another virus also transmitted by mosquitoes. And I think that's a good example that you brought about as to how biotechnology can help. And also, an Indian company run by a friend of mine has developed a vaccine, or at least they're in the process of developing a vaccine, and some of their initial results have been very good. And practically all new vaccines against infectious diseases today have been brought about through biotechnology, including how we got rid of, or at least the Ebola threat that we saw in West Africa last year. Believe it or not, all those medicine that helped cure the Ebola last year were all developed in GMO plants. Tobacco in Kentucky, that's how they were multiplied, the therapeutic proteins against the Ebola virus.
Questions there?
See, I'm going to check the chat room.
Sorry, it's thinking.
Here, there are some suggestions for things that should be developed.
Okay, go ahead.
Viagra corn.
Born for your horn.
Yeah. And this was actually a good one. Cats that people can't be allergic to.
Absolutely. Yeah,
that would sell. Not as well as Viagra corn though, but
yeah. And talking about allergy, that's something that's very important. And there are some people who are allergic to peanut, and that can be deadly to those. And we have many laboratories, including the one that I'm working here at Tuskegee University, where we are trying to develop peanuts that are hypoallergenic. Again, using the gene editing technology, and that's a possibility. And as you know, gluten is a big concern amongst people who eat wheat. And although it's taken an inordinate amount of proportion, disproportionate to the gluten intolerance, but nevertheless, celiac disease is a matter of serious concern to a proportion of people, and there's an allergy to rice, and all of that can be improved using biotechnology. We can develop hypoallergenic food that would not be causing allergic reactions like what we see today.
One of my favorite things that I've studied for genetic engineering is potential of using GMO crops as vaccines.
Absolutely.
So that's something that'd be brilliant for me, because I really hate needles. So
I know, if you can come up with an edible vaccine, that's true. But
I'm for a flu job. Here's a potato. That sounds brilliant.
There is one thing I wanted to bring up, Dr. Prakash, and we've had some recent experience with this, and this is the whole, the one big elephant in the room that anti-GMO people bring up, and that is Monsanto. So what's the scientific community, what's their view on Monsanto and the relationship with Monsanto?
Well, many of the scientists who are working with GMO crops recognize Monsanto as one of the leading company which has invested a lot of money in developing these technologies. They were one of the very first to develop a GMO crop, for instance, way back in the early 80s. And they spend something along like $1 billion a year on research and development, and many new innovations have come about because of the vast effort into research put in by Monsanto and other companies like Monsanto, such as DuPont, Dow, Bayer, BASF, and Syngenta are some of the few of the handful of companies that are spending a lot of money researching GMO crops. And so we do recognize this as an important company that plays a very significant role. But at the same time, those of us who are working in the public universities do recognize that a lot of crops that we work with, like I work with sweet potato and peanut, and there's not much commercial interest in working on this by the companies. And even crops such as cassava or plantain that is eaten in Africa, there's not going to be much interest by companies such as Monsanto to research these crops. So there is great need for public institutions such as universities and national research institutes to be funded so that they could do more of this genetic research, and they'll be able to bring about products into the from the public sector, where we can't depend on just companies alone to be developing new products in using biotechnology.
There is another thing that comes up, and this is a very common claim at the genetic modified crops, is that they're just being forced, like they're almost just being rushed through without any checks. I mean, how strict, how vigorous is the process between, you developing it in the lab and then, how many years later it's been planted in a field? I mean, is it really checked, as thoroughly as, or as not thoroughly as some people believe? Absolutely.
In fact, there's far more checks than what is necessary. A GM crop goes through just the testing for its safety from anywhere from 5 to 8 years, and it costs about $120 million for regulatory testing just to satisfy the regulatory requirements for many of for all these crops. And in comparison, you don't have absolutely no biosafety regulation at all if you develop a crop by conventional means. In that, it doesn't mean that crops developed by conventional breeding by or necessarily safe, but it's just that we have an inordinate amount of safety testing that goes with GM crops that that so those who claim that there's no testing done or there's not enough testing done, and that's simply not true. This is for the first time we have a tremendous amount of testing that goes on. And you should remember that if I'm trying to develop a corn, say here in the United States, I not only have to satisfy the regulatory requirements of US regulators such as USDA, EPA or FDA, but also because much of my corn gets exported into other countries such as Europe and China and Japan and South Korea and many of those countries, we also have to ensure that it meets their standards and it meets their regulatory requirements. And so what the downside of this is that because it requires so much testing and because it costs so much to get a biotech crop approved, it has only meant that few handful of companies have the financial wherewithal to do that. And so when you are trying to say Monsanto all the time, remember, by you doing all that, it only has left Monsanto and a few handful of companies in the playing field. There's no way small universities like the one I work with can come up with $120 million just to have one of my varieties approved. And so that is what has been the result of this anti-GMO industry, and that has helped mainly big companies now to be in the market.
So it's kind of, they've almost just, they believe Monsanto's but controlling everything, and by kind of their paranoia, they're actually sort of, creating the very demon they believe in, sort of thing.
Exactly. And so it's like big pharma, and they call it big ag, and that is true. If it costs about $120 million to bring about a new biotechnology crop variety into the market, you're not going to find small specialty crops and vegetables coming out of the market, and it has only meant that big players can afford to do that.
Yeah. I also remember those recently. I don't know if you heard of this. There was the case at some university, and it was some new variety of banana, and they wanted some human tests. Yeah, and it was quite weird because all these people say, oh, we don't have enough testing. We don't have enough testing. They run these tests. It's completely voluntary, and then they went and shut it down, which is, I can't really figure out the thinking behind that.
Right. And again, when golden rice, for instance, was being tried in Philippines, many of these anti-GMO groups, they went and ransacked that field and they destroyed it. And it routinely happens in France and also in Brazil last year. And so you would think that many of these groups who are opposed to biotechnology and claiming for more tests are really not interested in the safety or not interested in the test. I mean, that would tell you that they just have a vested interest in opposing this technology, and you can bring about any amount of tests and proof to show that it is safe, and they're not going to be able to be convinced.
Have you faced any backlash yourself? Because you're quite public on Twitter and the AG BioWorld's website. Have you faced any kind of negative reactions at all? Have you encountered any?
Well, I do see some criticisms now and then, but by and large, a lot of my the reception to what I say has been very positive, and I don't think I have encountered much negative reaction. I do find a large skeptical public when I give talks in many of the public forum. I do get a lot of questions, but that's understandable. That comes from a genuine curiosity and also stems from lack of knowledge, and people want to know more about it, and that is perfectly fine.
And Pumpkin, there's another chat room question there.
Yep, get up now.
And just to let everyone know, we've got 10 minutes left in the show, so any further questions, fire them in now. So carry on, Pumpkin.
Okay, guest, dear God, why didn't you just make an account? Okay, I'm just going to rephrase the whole question because it's terrible. Do you think something like Arctic apples may improve public view of GMOs?
Say it again, do Arctic apples, what's about it?
Yeah, do you think that something along the lines of Arctic apples would be used to improve the public view of GMOs?
It helps. Arctic apple is a type of apple developed by a small company in British Columbia and Canada. And what it does is they have turned off the gene that to trait for browning. So when you cut apples up, you will notice that within a few minutes it starts turning brown. And so much of the apple that is cut after a few hours you just cannot eat it. And what this Arctic apple they have done is to reduce that browning when you cut it, and so it remains fresh for a longer time. And so that can clearly help. And also there's another company that has developed a similar technology with potatoes, because there is a lot of wastage that goes on in potato industry, and they have turned off the genes related to browning, and also they have reduced the acrylamide. When you make French fries, it secretes a compound called acrylamide, and that is in large amounts can be carcinogenic. And so they have reduced or eliminated the acrylamide content into this potato. And these two innovations can in the public eyes can be seen. This is a kind of technology that can relate to something unlike something like herbicide resistance or insect resistance that only the farmers can relate to. And this is one of the traits that public would be able to relate to. And so I believe this, when you bring about products like this, it would help in improving the perception of what GMO is about in the public eyes.
Okay, and we have another chat room question there, Pumpkin.
Hey, looks like I have a job today. Okay, Soulfire says, can't GMO technology increase crop yield to such an extent that it could feed the world? If so, what would be the consequences versus the benefits? That's my question for the next after.
Right. See, so far, many of the GM technologies are specifically focused on traits such as herbicide tolerance and insect resistance. And as a consequence of that, they've also increased the yield, but not a great deal, because the intent was not to increase the yield. But we have a lot of research in the pipeline that would directly increase the productivity of croplands. One good example is a rice. Rice is a most important crop that feeds the world, especially in Asia. But it is not very productive because it follows a type of photosynthesis called C3 photosynthesis. But on the other hand, corn and sugarcane or other grasses which have a better system of photosynthesis called C4 type of photosynthesis. So there's a great deal of research going on to see how we can introduce some of the elements of C4 photosynthesis into rice. In that way, we can make the rice more productive. And there's a lot of other research that would help increase our crop yields. We can double or triple the crop yields with many of these increased many of these alterations that I'm talking about, and that will help to clearly increase the yield in the future. See, as the humanity right now, we're close to about 7 billion people, and we'll be 9 billion people in 15, 20 years time, and we would need every solution to help increase our food production. In the last 30, 40 years, some of the food production increase around the world also came from increasing the area of agriculture, especially in places like Brazil and Indonesia. We cleared a large amount of forest land to put agricultural land for oil palm or soybean and things of the crops of that nature. But we don't have that luxury anymore. And we shouldn't be clearing our forests to grow more food. But the only way we can feed the ever increasing population is to see how we can grow more food with the existing farmlands. And we would need every trick in our toolbox to be able to do so. It's going to take new varieties of crops in genetic engineering. It's going to take very smart precision farming tools, so we don't have to be using too much fertilizer or pesticides. And probably new automation. There are already farmers in Australia and France are using drones on the farm, and there's robots going to be used on the farm. So I see the big data is something being used. Monsanto has bought a company for $1 billion called Climate Corporation, where they use a lot of data into making our agriculture more smarter. And so I would think moving forward, we would need every science innovation that we can put our hands on. And biotechnology is going to be one important component in that, so that we can help feed the world, not only to make sure that everyone in this earth has good amount of food, but also nutritional food, but we also grow that in a manner that is not as destructive to the environment as some of the agriculture has been in the recent past.
On that note, what about the idea of plants that can grow in, say, the desert? Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
you see, that's a very important component, part of our research and trying to develop crop plants that are that help withstand periods of drought, because you do even in the toughest deserts, such as in Kalahari Desert and in many of the Saharan desert, you do find some trees growing there, right?
Yeah.
And so we are learning from how some of these plants can grow in very water deprived areas. And by transferring genes from some of those plants into our crop plants, we may not be able to grow them in full desert like what you're visualizing, but clearly we can make them more drought tolerant, at least in the near term. And not only making them drought tolerant, there's also need to make them heat tolerant with the increasing temperature, and also because of the increasing sea level, a lot of our crop plants are going to be salinized. There's salt water is going to creep in. So we need to bring in a greater level of salt tolerance and even submergence tolerance, because a lot of rivers are going to rise and many of the crop paddies in Asia are going to be submerged. And so we need to come up with technologies to see how we can bring in submerged flooding tolerance into our crop plants too. And again, genetic technologies would help us go that way.
Okay, everyone, we're coming up for the final 2 minutes, so I think we can start to wrap it up there. I'll quick go around the panel for your final thoughts. Marty.
Yeah, I'm going to say the same thing I say every time someone comes along to talk about biotechnology or anything in that sort of area. I think this is really important stuff. I wish I knew more about it. So it's always very interesting to have someone come along who knows what they're talking about that. Because kids doesn't.
Thank you.
And on that note, Kitch, what do you have to say?
Screw you, Marty.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah, no, it was brilliant. It's great. Just major appreciation to our guests today for coming on. It was brilliant. Yeah.
All right, and Pumpkin.
I showed up late. I didn't have a clue what was being talked about when I arrived. I may have learned a few things, but please, the next time you're talking to the Irish, don't mention the potatoes. It scares us. It scares us too much.
I'm sorry, I understand.
So, Dr. Prakash, if people listening to this, if they want to get in touch with you with further questions, or if they just want to reach you in general, how would they do that?
Oh, as you know, I'm on the Twitter and the Facebook, with my handle is AgBioWorld, AGBIOWORLD. They can easily contact me through a direct message on Twitter, or they could just send me an email, prakashcs1@gmail.com.
Yeah. Right, and we also give our guests like any last message or any last thoughts you have yourself.
Oh, myself, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with a very broad public base you have. And the way I look at it is, biotechnology, the public skepticism of this technology is very natural. When you look at the history of food, many of the food technologies have been resisted and opposed. Italy is so famous for tomatoes. Believe it or not, they had banned tomatoes for about 100 years. When pasteurization came about, took more than 100 years for it to be adapted. And so a lot of technologies related to food tend to be resisted in the beginning by the public, but down the road, when their society recognizes some of these new innovations, they're helpful and they are very beneficial, but they don't have the kind of risk that they thought out to be, they would eventually turn around and accept it. I do believe GMOs controversy will go away down the road, and that you're going to see great acceptance of it everywhere.
So in about 80 years, if the world is on fire, everything will be perfect.
Yep. Okay, thanks everyone for turning out and chat room with you. Show your appreciation for Dr. Prakash. Thumbs up. We've all, thoroughly enjoyed this. Excuse me, I'm coughing there. Next week, we're back in 2 weeks. Our special guest is Concordance, which I'm sure many of you are all aware about. We'll be talking about viruses and health scares. Kitch, we don't really need a massive introduction, but you give us a rundown of Concordance.
He's a science skeptic YouTuber. Does a lot of videos on various scientific topics such as AIDS denialism, various medical health, pseudoscience claims, and I think he's also on the Magic Sandwich Show.
Oh yes, yeah.
And all around terrific, absolutely just terrific person all around.
Yeah.
Makes really interesting videos.
Yeah, I said that I think for the audience, we don't really need to say much more, but we're all looking forward to that. And we'll see everyone in 2 weeks. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone, and have a good weekend.
Drink yourself
Thank
into
you.
a
Bye-bye.
It's hip to be a hipster. Cool to be a hipster. Shit if you're not hipster. So hip to be a hipster.
Started worrying about the negative image of biotechnology that was being painted, and started saying that they're not going to be using GMO products in their foods. And so that's how the whole cascade of events that began, and that's what we have today is the whole controversy about GMO.
Yeah, if I could jump in there, you said a couple of things that I thought sounded very interesting. First, you mentioned mad cow disease. Yeah, I can sort of understand why people would become more safety conscious because of something like that, because I mean, that was a big deal. But have people been linking that to biotech or GMOs? What's that all about?
No, not really. Yeah, I don't think there's no relationship between mad cow and the GMO, and people have not linked to it. But the point is, the GMOs were being introduced into our food chain in the middle of the 90s, when the mad cow disease also made its entry. And so what I'm saying is, the same people who are saying that there was no risk of mad cow disease, especially in England, for instance, you had an agriculture minister who was reassuring the public that English beef is safe. If you eat it, you're not going to get any mad cow. And he famously ate a hamburger and fed it to his child on television. And later, it was proven that mad cow could be transmitted from cows to humans. And so what I'm trying to say is that the whole trust about the food safety authorities and about the regulators were eroded as a component of my research, but never knew that over time that this would become so controversial as it has become today.
And why do you think it has become so controversial?
Well, looking back, I believe that the whole controversy has really been simply being orchestrated by groups that have a vested interest in opposing biotechnology, because as I can, as I told earlier, in the beginning it was not controversial, even in Europe. For instance, in England in 1996, they had a tomato that was genetically engineered, and it was a tomato puree. It was very clearly labeled as it was genetically modified, and this was just it was in the supermarket, and nobody had any opposition to that. And I think there was a range of factors, again, especially in Europe, how the whole opposition to biotechnology was sown and spread around the world because of a range of factors. I think because of the mad cow disease that came along in the late 90s, that eroded a lot of trust amongst regulators and food safety authorities in the minds of the public. And also several green groups saw this as a very lucrative target that they can attack and then get into the more into the public arena. And also many of the newspapers started sensationalizing biotechnology stories, although many of them were not true. And so I think this is how it got started. And then several food companies
Improvement research on food crops. Sorry, I'm literally just scratching everything down. So he served in the USDA Agricultural Biotechnology and part of the advisory committee, and he was a part of the advisory committee into the Department of Biotech in India. He has been instrumental in catalyzing the scientific community in many countries to be more proactive in the area of biotechnology. And his website, Biotech, provides important information and promotes discussion of ag biotechnology among scientists, policymakers, activists, and journalists. And welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
And Kitch will let you start with the introductory questions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I think pretty standard for question that we usually do. For first is how did you get involved in the area that you were researching?
Oh, see, I was trained primarily as a plant breeder, where we have used many traditional tools in genetics to help develop new varieties of crop plants. And in the mid 80s, when I was doing my PhD, the biotechnology came along, and then this was logical for a lot of us who were working in plant breeding to start learning about the new tools in biotechnology, which is primarily starting with plant tissue culture and then introduction of the genes into crop plants, because it was one of the new, we primarily saw it and still do as just an additional tool in developing new crop plants, and quite excited about it at the time. And so that's how I came along into using biotechnology.
And good evening, everyone. Welcome to Trolling with Logic for the 26th of March 2016. Just to all the usual announcements, we do take live calls during the course of the show tonight at the Skype contact Trolling with Logic. Send us a PM and we'll add you in due course. Please don't call the show, so we'll just distract us. We will add you to the call in due time. So just with all that out the way, it's a pretty depleted panel tonight, but all the introductions. Marty, what's happening?
I had some connection problems, but
Yeah.
it looks like it's working now.
Yeah. Oh, and just one quick announcement. There was problems setting up the YouTube stream. I just couldn't get my head around what was going on, so it is VON only tonight. So just a few issues, but I think we're okay now. Anyway, I'll quickly jump over. And Kitch, how are you doing?
Fantastic. I'm fully back from the sun.
We can see that. An Irishman in the sun. You know what the results are. So, Kitch, you're here to introduce our special guest tonight.
Yes, our guest tonight is Dr. and I'm really sorry because I know I'm going to pronounce this badly, Dr. Channapatna S. Prakash. He received his bachelor's degree in agriculture and a master's in genetics, and he received a PhD in forestry/genetics from the Australian National University. He's a professor of plant genetics, biotechnology, and genomics at Tuskegee University, where he researches genes.
And it was the same regulators and the food safety authorities were saying, hey, now GMOs are safe. You have nothing to worry about. You see, and so it was in that climate of erosion of trust when GMOs.
Okay. Now that cleared that up. Another thing you mentioned was groups were.
Honesty, but it's just the groups such as Greenpeace is the famous example.
Yeah.
And Greenpeace traditionally, as you know, in the mid 80s, there was the Rainbow Warrior, and the main campaign was against the nuclear plants and the nuclear weapons. And then, of course, they started attacking the GMO. They started beginning to attack the GMOs. And the Green Party in West Germany and some of the green groups in Europe also started campaigning against the GMO, primarily because this was a new area. And I do believe it's lucrative in the sense because many of these groups also had to raise money and starting attacking GMOs as an unsafe food. And also it was something being introduced through corporations, mainly American corporations, was also good for fundraising and also politically very appealing for many of these groups.
Yeah, because they have political goals as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. A lot of anti-authority